Hey everybody, in this video I'm going to be talking about Stephen King's 1989 novel The Dark Half and showing what to look for when identifying first US and first UK editions of the book. The first US edition was published by Viking and had a massive print run of I think 1.5 million copies. This is a pretty common book, although it is now 33 years old, so it can be tough to find one in really nice shape, but they are out there. Look for a jacket price of $21.95, and around this time, Viking started adding number lines to the book. So look for the language first published in 1989 by Viking Penguin, and then there's a number line, and pretty obvious the number line will include the number 1. That's how you know you have a first edition. Underneath the jacket, nice black boards with SK imprinted in gold foil, black cloth over the spine, and gold lettering. All in all, it's a pretty handsome book. One of the things that I like about The Dark Half is the purple end papers. I just think it's kind of a nice touch. And it complements the colors from the jacket really well. Just kind of a small thing, but it's a nice touch. I like it. So anyway, there's the first US edition. The UK edition was published by Hodder and Stoughton. There's the back cover, same back cover photo as the US edition. Inside the jacket, look for a price of £12.95 net in UK. And on the copyright page, first published in Great Britain, 1989. And underneath the jackets, look for black boards, just one color, unbroken all the way around and on the spine. Really nice gold lettering, really pops. So there is the UK edition of The Dark Half. I know I'm like a broken record in these videos where I talk about paper quality, specifically the sort of inferior paper quality used in UK editions of the 70s and 80s, but The Dark Half, I don't know if this is just a coincidence or what, but my copy of Dark Half, the UK edition, is still holding its own all these years later, and in fact is a little bit brighter than the US edition. So this was from 1989, and for comparison, Tommyknockers from 1987, which is a lot more common for what I've seen in UK editions from the 70s and 80s. So anyway, Dark Half is holding its own, still looking pretty nice. In a side-by-side comparison of the cover artwork, again, this is also pretty common from this era. The US edition, creepy. It's more subtle, more understated. Kind of see, you really have to look. It's a little subtle, but there's an image of a skull, almost looks like an x-ray of a skull on the cover. The UK edition, which is also fairly typical, has a much more colorful, eye-catching, and elaborate dust jacket artwork image, which it's not, the difference is not as bad as between like Tommyknockers, where the US edition I just think is terrible and the UK edition is really interesting, but it is a pretty noticeable difference. Stephen King's name, I notice, is still quite large on the UK edition, but you know, it's in the ballpark as the title. And in the US edition, obviously they wanted Stephen King's name to be seen from completely on the other side of the bookstore, because it's his name that people were buying, and the title is almost of secondary importance. But yeah, anyway, side by side, I prefer the UK edition, and I don't think it's just because I'm less familiar with it, so I find it more novel and more interesting. I really do think it's a nice looking cover art image, and I prefer it. Dark Half is interesting in terms of special editions, limited editions. It was featured in a project by Dragon Rebound, which is sort of a side project from Suntup, rebinding Stephen King first edition book blocks in very elaborate new covers, jackets, enclosures. So Dark Half was featured in one of those, and it looks really cool. The nice black and white sort of duality color scheme going on. But as far as just your standard signed, limited, gift, artist, lettered, what have you, Dark Half has not had one in either the US or in the UK. So the first US, first UK editions are truly that. They are the first editions worldwide. Sometimes the special editions beat the trade editions to market, which makes them actually the first edition. But in the case of the Dark Half, this is what to look for in terms of first editions. Dark Half, so I have to admit, I don't know why, it's not really embarrassing or anything, but I used to look down my nose on people that listened to audiobooks and then afterwards said, oh, I read that one. To me, you didn't read it. You just listened to somebody else read it. But now in my job, I do a lot more driving around, a lot more traveling. So I've been able to knock a lot of things off of my list thanks to audiobooks. And I've heard some pretty amazing performances that in some ways afterward the book actually sticks in my head better than if I read the actual paper copy in the standard fashion. And the Dark Half is one of those. The audiobook narrator was really good, and the book really held me in thrall and overcomes some of the issues of the plot. So spoiler alert, but the pseudonym George Stark, who's named in honor of author Donald Westlake's alter ego Richard Stark, is buried in a ceremony similar to how Richard Bachman died of cancer of the pseudonym. And so there's a tombstone, there's a ceremony, there's a photo op, but of course there's no body in the grave because George Stark is not real. But in the book, he becomes real, claws his way up out of the ground, and starts stalking and brutally seeking revenge on those who outed the alter ego, the pseudonym, in the first place. So while I can believe, like, once Stark is real, he's really real, and he's interesting, and he's hard-boiled, and he's scary. At one point, and I think this is a stroke of genius, actually rips a prosthetic limb off of another character and then proceeds to beat that person to death with their own prosthetic limb. I mean, it's sick and it's macabre, but it's the kind of thing that is so demented that I can't help but just absolutely love it. So when I didn't think about where Stark came from, I found the novel very easy to get lost in. But every once in a while, reality would stick its cold hand in, and I would think, but wait, this guy was imaginary, right? He's a pseudonym. So that's a pretty a pretty big plot hole, but there's a lot of just energy, passion, and conviction in the writing, and overall, I found the book really enjoyable. And like I said, the audiobook narrator was excellent. I thought that Stephen King sort of had his come to Jesus intervention moment with his family in 87, 88, and that Tommyknockers was the last book that he wrote, in a drug and alcohol-fueled haze. But I've done a little bit more digging and reading and researching, and Dark Half may actually be the last one from that period. And while it is a little bit more mannered and controlled than Tommyknockers, it does kind of have that same demented 80s coke head Stephen King energy that he sort of pivoted away from as he tried to move past that period of his life and find his muse and his talent again in the early 90s. But regardless, I think Dark Half is a better overall book than Tommyknockers. It still strains credibility a bit. It's fascinating that it explores the relationship between Stephen King and Richard Bachman, and it's like a lot of Stephen King books, there's autobiographical elements to it, and I know that it was upsetting for Stephen King when he was outed, when the Bachman persona was outed in the 80s, and this is just sort of in a sense, it's a fascinating way to read and see how he comes to terms with that and processes it. And also has some really interesting, not very flattering things to say about artists and writers, and kind of how inherently selfish they are and superstitious, always worried that they'll wake up one day and find that their talent is just gone, and the measures they will go to protect that talent and to nurture it, even at the expense of those they love. So I think the subtext, the background of Dark Half is just as, if not more, interesting than the book itself. And I don't consider it an all-time classic Stephen King, but it is solid. I've said it before, I'm sure I will say it many more times, but I've never picked up a Stephen King book that was badly written. His writing is engaging, and it's easy to get sucked into the world. I've had some where the stories were kind of lacking and the plot developments were left me a little cold, but the writing is always solid, and The Dark Half is an example of that. It's well written and was one of the biggest selling books of the 80s, even though it came out right at the tail end of that decade. So it's quite popular. There's a movie adaptation directed by George Romero that I have actually... Is it George Romero? I'll have to look that up. But I've never actually watched the movie adaptation. I am sorry to say. Now that I say it out loud, why haven't I ever watched the movie adaptation? I should check that out. But anyway, look for the US edition. It is, if you can find it in really nice shape for under $20, you're doing really good. This copy I found at a local half-price books, probably for $8, no more than 10, and it's in really nice shape. So be patient, hang out, keep your eye out. There were 1.5 million of these originally printed, so they are out there. This book is easy to find, can be hard to find in really nice shape. And The UK edition makes a nice counterpoint, especially with the really cool artwork, and the two look really nice together on the shelf. So anyway, that's about all there is to say about the Dark Half, and I hope that you have enjoyed this. I thank you very much for your time, and I will talk to you later. Bye.